Ses niye yakındı? Can you hear me?
Yes.
You can? Okay, perfect,
Now
because
can
it was
hear.
ultimate silence on my part. Hi.
Yes, hi.
I'm trying to organize my background. It doesn't look great, but
Don't worry.
okay.
May I ask you, you were in Thessaloniki in some conference about Pontic Hellenism some years ago?
Yes, I work on Pontic Christianism. Yeah, that was big.
We met there.
Okay, who is speaking now? I can't really see who is speaking.
Hello, everyone.
Oh, yes. Hi.
Greetings.
Hi.
Καλησπέρα.
Kalispera says. My name is Alex, Alex Kyrou. Evangelia, I see you on the screen. I do not see others.
Yes, you're quite right.
I hope you can see me though.
Yes.
Yes, we can see you. Mhm.
Well, for that, I apologize.
It's not your fault, the mother nurture.
Loukas,
Yes,
is that you? Is that you also in the circle? Hasn't joined us yet. That's all right.
Yeah.
Ναι, κύριε Κοτσάνη. Ναι, μιλήστε τώρα.
Here I am, Dr. Kyrou. How are you?
I'm fine. Loukas, am I speaking with you now?
Εκεί είναι η κάμερα.
Can you see me?
Yes.
Yes.
How are you doing?
I'm fine, thank you. How's Dr. Elizabeth?
Oh, Elizabeth is quite well. Thank you very much. I'll pass along your warm regards.
Thanks. So in a few minutes we will begin.
Okay.
Θα μπούμε στο YouTube.
Ναι, απλώς και εγώ δεν θα βλέπω τώρα όμως πουθενά. Δηλαδή θα βλέπω εκεί. Οπότε δεν ξέρω τι
Θα
γίνεται.
σε βλέπουν από εκεί.
Ναι, θα με βλέπω. Ναι, εγώ δεν θα βλέπω. Ίσως έπρεπε να φέρω το κομπιούτερ μου και εγώ.
Κάθεσαι εδώ.
Όχι, εκεί.
Μπορείς να καθίσεις.
Λουκά, συγγνώμη, αλλά δεν σας ακούω αυτή τη στιγμή.
Δεν μιλούσε μάλλον.
Oh.
We was arranging things.
Wonderful.
Εδώ έχει άλλο Wi-Fi, έτσι, το ξέρει κανείς το... Μικρή. Το Wi-Fi.
Μανώλη.
Είναι συνδεδεμένο μόνο...
Μανώλη, ποιος είναι το δικό σου Wi-Fi εδώ?
Όπως το γράφει με την κάτω παύλα. Director. Α, δεν την έχουμε πάρει. Πάω στο γραφείο. Αν σας μη σας δώσω, εγώ δεν έχω iPhone 6. Όχι, εγώ δεν μπορώ να το γράφω.
Γιατί θα σου δίνει κατευθείαν, θα σε βγάζαμε την πρώτη τηλέφωνο και το παίρνω σου.
Όχι αυτό, αλλά...
Λοιπόν, τώρα είσαι εδώ. Και βλέπουν εσένα.
Να το βάλω εκεί, από εκεί. Δεν το έχω μπροστά. Εντάξει, τον έκοψα τον Νίκο. Κι όμως δεν κόβηκε.
Νίκο, αν μιλήσεις εδώ δυνατά, θα σε ακούσει εδώ.
Χριστό,
Ναι, Ευαγγελία μου.
το πρωί δεν πρόλαβα να παρακολουθήσω από την αρχή, παρακολούθησα από το YouTube. Στο YouTube ο ήχος είναι λίγο χαμηλός, ίσως πρέπει το μικρόφωνο να είναι πιο κοντά στους ομιλητές.
Εδώ είναι κανονικά.
Τώρα είναι εγώ στο Zoom είναι πολύ καλά.
Ναι, αυτός ο ήχος είναι όμως στο Zoom. Δεν ξέρω τι γίνεται με στο YouTube, αλλά έτσι πως με ακούς τώρα, έτσι ακριβώς μιλάνε.
Α, εντάξει, ωραία. Εντάξει, Χριστό μου.
Εντάξει.
Ναι.
Zeynep, can you hear me?
Ναι.
Zeynep?
Zeynep, yeah.
Για μιλάμε.
Can you hear me?
Τον ακούτε το Λουκά?
Ναι, ναι, ναι.
Ναι.
Καλά.
Πολύ καλά. Πολύ
Πολύ
καλά.
καλά, μια χαρά.
Ωραία. Λουκά, από εδώ θα ακούγεται ο ήχος πλέον. Εκεί είναι κλειστό.
Zeynep, this is Alex. I just wanted to mention I took notice of the fact that you teach at the University of Potsdam.
I just started, actually. I'm going to teach my first course next semester.
Oh, congratulations to you.
Thank you.
I wanted to mention it happens to be one of my daughter's favorite German cities. She was there just before COVID and she fell in love with the place.
Apparently, it's a very, pretty place, but I really didn't have a chance to see much, thanks to COVID. So hopefully, I'll share your daughter's feelings soon. Yeah,
Well, enjoy and congratulations with your appointment.
Thank you. And where are you based?
I'm based in a university just outside Boston. It's called Salem State University. It's part of the university.
Yeah.
Part of the University of Massachusetts system.
Yeah. I used to teach at Dartmouth.
Oh, wonderful! What a wonderful university.
Yeah.
a little isolated, a little removed from much of civilization, but a beautiful
little.
place.
The emphasis, I guess.
Well, a lot.
Under the little.
I wanted to be polite.
Yeah.
When were you there? Just recently?
No, I was teaching there between 2011 and 2016.
Okay. Did you happen to meet, he's now emeritus, so you might not have come across him, a scholar who works on modern Greece named Peter Bean. He's actually a professor of literature, modern Greek literature. No? Okay.
No, unfortunately not.
That is my only living connection to darkness.
It's more than most people, it's quite. Yeah, it's an interesting place to live, to say the least.
I can well imagine. We seem to be running just a tad bit late, I see.
Yeah.
I don't think I've participated in a single Zoom-based conference that started when scheduled, so this is the norm, I'm sure.
Yeah, I guess people also count on that.
Yeah.
So that's the expectation. Audience comes late, speakers
Of course.
take their time, and yeah.
I'm looking forward to your talk. And by the way, I hope I can curry from you some latitude and favor as someone who is not an Ottomanist, not an expert. I hope you'll be forgiving when it comes to things that I'm sure anyone can take me to task for easily.
It's totally fine. I mean, this is an important, I mean, unfortunately, I mean, I can read just a little bit of Greek. I used to be better, and it's something that I should really work on.
Yes.
Because, I mean, a significant part of my work is on crypto-Christians of Pontus.
Oh, wonderful. What a fascinating subject.
I mean, they're a fascinating community. They were.
Yeah. Are you studying Demotic Greek, or are you actually studying Pondian Greek?
I mean, I studied a little bit of modern Greek to be able to read the sources, but obviously studying Pontiaca would have been useful. But I mean, for the last couple of years, I've been not doing much language work.
Yes.
And so I actually collected quite a bit of, you know, their journals they published, especially after they moved to Greece and things like that, talking about their villages and stuff like that.
Yes.
But my work on them mostly relies on Ottoman sources.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, there are incredible sources at the Ottoman archives.
Yes.
Interrogation records, all kinds of stuff. I mean,
I would well imagine.
Yeah.
I always thought that there are no sources on crypto-Christianism, but from you, I heard that we have so many archives, interrogation, and so on this subject. Yeah.
Incredible. I mean, I actually most recently found other stuff like the Eastern Pontus communities, like about especially their conscription, and after they went to Russia, Ottoman papers searching for them. So I now have even more archival sources. I can't believe that's happening, but it's incredible. So much has been kept at the Ottoman archives.
Is this 19th century?
19th century, early 20th century, yeah.
Okay. So the type of material probably that Darren Gill had looked at too. Tiny bit, yeah.
he's my kind of, we have an interesting relationship. He looked some of that stuff, but not as closely as he should, because of the scale of his research. He tries to understand what state did with these communities, whereas I try to understand what these communities do. So that's the reason why I rely heavily on archival work, because it's hard to imagine, but they said a lot of stuff even at the Ottoman courts. They were quite a brave community.
My origin is from Trebizond.
Which part of Trebizond? I could tell, but
sorry to interrupt.
We were having a good conversation here.
In Pontiac, yeah.
Good afternoon to everybody. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for attending our session, our fourth session of this conference, the third for today. My name is Loukas Katsonis. I am chairman of the Foreign Affairs Institute of Athens. So we will begin with Dr. Alexandros, who is a professor of history and director of the program in East European and Russian Studies at Salem State University in Salem, Massachusetts. He teaches on the Balkans, Byzantium, and the Ottoman Empire. Dr. Kyrou has guest lectured at Harvard, Princeton, Yale, and Oxford universities. He is the author of the book under the title Guide to the Greek Pamphlet Collection at the Firestone Library, Princeton University. So, Dr. Kyrou, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the generous introduction. Thanks to Loukas. Thank you, Father Grekas, for your kind invitation to have me participate in these proceedings. And please accept my gratitude to all the members of the Scientific Commission for organizing, and to all the constituent offices and institutes for supporting this fascinating and important conference. Well, to begin my presentation, The conventions and values found in Western historiography a century ago had helped to manufacture a decidedly Orientalist view of the Ottoman Empire, one that bore little resemblance to the actual complexities and historical experience of Ottoman state and society. Today, the transformed conventions and values of Western historiography have helped to manufacture a decidedly revisionist view of much of the Ottoman Empire that also bears little resemblance to the actual complexities and historical experiences of Ottoman state and society. In current popular fashion, the Islamic Ottoman Empire is essentialized and often revered as a state in which Christians and Jews enjoyed tolerance and benevolence for centuries in a rich, multicultural, religiously diverse system, far more enlightened and accepting of all peoples, and thus more peaceful and humane than any European society or state. This view of the Ottoman Empire as a place of religious tolerance where diverse peoples lived free from discrimination, abuse, and insecurity has become a widely accepted narrative, especially among non-specialist scholars and even policymakers who project onto the Ottoman experience an ahistorical and distorted version of the current Western notions of multiculturalism and diversity. What I intend to do through this admittedly generalist presentation is to deconstruct the myth of Ottoman tolerance and link that issue in a brief conclusion to one specific causal aspect of Islamization among subject Christians, and that is the practice of the devshirme. The current popular narrative of the Ottoman Empire as a place of enlightened exceptionalism is premised upon the great foundational myth that the Ottoman Empire was a beacon of religious tolerance. Many historians have confused the mere presence of multiple religions and the conditional privilege to practice religion in the Ottoman Empire with actual religious freedom. This view has promoted the myth of religious tolerance by recasting the Ottoman state's effective indifference toward its non-Muslim subjects as benevolence. Such interpretations misrepresent the Ottoman's institutional mechanisms for control over these communities as evidence of autonomy and freedom for Christians and Jews. Although the state did not typically involve itself directly in the daily internal affairs of non-Muslim religious communities, this did not equate to a commitment to religious freedom, much less to any limitation on the state's power to interfere in the governance and life of those communities. The Ottoman state did not involve itself in the affairs of non-Muslims because it did not have to do so. Instead, the state relied upon its own appointed intermediary community and religious leaders to ensure non-Muslim subjects' loyalty to the Ottoman state. In form and function, this system of conditional self-administration, the millets, by religious communities required complete submission to the will and interests of the Ottoman state. In the final analysis, the Christian and Jewish millets were allowed to retain their traditions and some limited self-administration because such an arrangement benefited the Ottomans, not because it reflected some Ottoman commitment to tolerance. The millet system, like most Ottoman structures, was intended to control and extract as much as possible from non-Muslim subjects with as little cost and effort as possible to the state. The Christians and Jews' customs, social structures, and what was left of their religious institutions were of no interest to the Ottomans, provided these communities continued to produce the taxes and resources to satisfy the empire's needs and did not challenge the state's absolute power or the supremacy of Islam. Now, much is often made of the fact that the Ottomans ruled over an enormous expanse of territory, a vast empire in which diverse peoples and religions coexisted. But coexistence did not equate to religious equality or even necessarily tolerance. Inasmuch as tolerance denotes, among other things, the absence of discrimination or persecution, the Ottoman Empire cannot be considered a state that practiced religious tolerance. Christians and Jews, albeit infidels, were considered, quote unquote, peoples of the book, because they, like Muslims, are considered to be the children of Abraham, meaning all three faiths were connected to the Old Testament. As peoples of the book, the status of Christians and Jews was clearly prescribed by Islamic law. Indeed, Sharia mandates that Christians and Jews were to be treated as officially dhimmi. Dhimmi, unlike other non-Muslims such as Zoroastrians and Yazidis, were quote-unquote protected people, people free in principle to practice their religion unmolested. However, as dhimmi, their status was in every respect inferior to that of Muslims, a fact reinforced by a litany of regulations commanded by the Quran to ensure their subordination to Islam. The official inferiority of the dhimmi was expressed in countless ways. Islamic law clearly stipulated how dhimmi were to be treated in all areas of life, and the entire Ottoman system was accordingly premised upon the superiority of Islam, manifest in the legal distinction and official inferiority of non-Muslims. Although Christians and Jews were allowed to practice their faiths behind the closed doors of their churches and synagogues, restrictions were omnipresent. It was a system of superiority and inferiority, of separate and unequal communities, a system of apartheid premised upon religion rather than race or ethnicity. Here, incidentally, I want to make it clear that I am not implying Ottoman society, albeit divided into officially superior Muslim and officially inferior non-Muslim communities, was locked in constant hostility, animus, or conflict. Certainly not everywhere and certainly not always, but for most of the empire's history, most local Muslims and dhimmi populations lived alongside each other, interacted with each other, and lived in relatively peaceful terms and conditions. Most Ottoman subjects, Muslims and non-Muslims alike, were ordinary people, very similar to each other, preoccupied with making a living and caring for families. Nonetheless, dhimmi, especially Christians, confronted by an arbitrary, all-powerful, theocratic state that relegated them to an officially inferior status, did experience regular discriminations, sometimes abuses, and ultimately often insecurity, even if they were not confronted with constant persecution. Their place in society, in other words, was clear. They were largely left to their own devices, but they were inferior. The Ottoman Empire's system of taxation reinforced the officially inferior status of non-Muslim subjects. The payment of distinct and much heavier taxes represented the most burdensome aspect of religious inequality in the daily life of the dhimmi. The disproportionate and onerous taxes imposed on Christians reflected the Ottoman state's view of their role, purpose, and function in Islamic society. The native Christian peoples were seen simply as a resource to be harnessed and exploited as much as possible. Of course, the most notorious and humiliating tax imposed exclusively on Orthodox Christians was the devshirme, the child tribute, the child tax. The child tribute was leveled primarily against Albanians, Bulgarians, and Greeks. This objectively cruel and inhumane practice involved the forcible and systematic expropriation and abduction of Christian children from their families. It involved their forced conversion to Islam and ultimately their training into Muslim state service. The mere threat of the devshirme, arbitrarily and suddenly breaking up Christian families to serve the Muslim ruling class, was sufficient to cause several local rebellions and horrifying enough to produce terror and psychological trauma across generations well beyond its official termination in the mid-17th century. Many admirers of the Ottoman Empire insist that the devshirme was actually a remarkable system that provided Christian children who would have otherwise been shut out of careers in the Ottoman state with an opportunity to enjoy upward social mobility, as in fact was the experience of some of the former Christian children who, as Muslim servant slaves to the Sultan, did rise to the highest rungs of the military or administrative structures of the empire. This interpretation, however, ignores several facts which call into question the supposed benevolent origins and character of the devshirme. One, The Devshirme was implemented first in 1380 as a punitive measure against Greek communities in Asia Minor that had rebelled against Ottoman rule. And it was valorized thereafter by the state as a righteous Muslim penalization imposed on Christian subjects since their ancestors had resisted Ottoman conquest. 2, it was a compulsory rather than voluntary practice. 3, it demonstrated the Ottoman state's contempt for the religious identity and community integrity of its Christian populations. 4, the Devshirme was not extended to poor Muslim families that would have presumably been grateful for the opportunity to improve their children's lives. We have, in fact, many examples of Muslim families who tried to have their sons recruited by the Devshirme only to be consistently rejected by the Ottoman authorities. And 5, only a very small proportion of the Christian children enslaved by the Devshirme experienced any meaningful elite upward social mobility. Underscoring the uncritical, if not eulogistic, character of Ottoman historiography and in particular popular writing on the Devshirme, it is interesting to note that other similar historical models and recent examples of policy involving state abduction, enslavement, and forced religious conversion of children are recognized by modern scholars and state leaders alike as genocide, not as systems for upward social mobility. For the Ottomans, the Devshirme was both a convenient practice to remind Christians of their inferior status, and above all, it was a practical way to generate slave labor, to regularly tap an inexhaustible supply of workers, servants, and soldiers to be used by the state and the ruling class. Conversely, for Christians, the Devshirme was an unmitigated disaster, a tragedy that punctuated their powerlessness and their captivity. It was yet another heavy cost for clinging to their faith. But for some Christians, it was a cost that was simply too heavy to bear. For some Christians, it was a sufficient and explicable inducement to produce apostasy. The Devshirme advanced the Islamization of considerable segments of the Orthodox Christian populations in Asia Minor, but especially in the Balkans, in 2 distinct and interconnected ways. First, the Devshirme produced the obvious, direct, and forced Islamization of countless Christian children taken from their families across several centuries. Second, the Devshirme indirectly promoted the conversion to Islam of innumerable Christian families and communities across the same period. Not willing to risk their children to permanent removal and separation by the Ottoman authorities was a very powerful incentive for many Christians to convert to Islam and thus, as Muslims, enjoy exemption, protection from the child tribute. A direct causal relationship existed between the practice of the Devshirme and the Islamization of significant parts of the native Christian population. Patterns and concentration of conversion bear this out. For example, most conversions to Islam among the Christian populations conquered by the Ottomans in the Balkans took place during the 15th, 16th, and early 17th centuries. This period coincided with the time when the Devshirme was most effectively enforced. Furthermore, significant, steady numbers of conversions ended once the Devshirme was no longer being practiced. In addition, it is noteworthy that the largest concentrations of conversion and Islamization corresponded to those geographic regions where the Devshirme was carried out most consistently and most aggressively. Specifically, Central Albania, Bosnia, Central and Western Macedonia, Thessaly, and Thrace. Conversely, the regions which experienced virtually no Islamization were the areas that were generally exempted from the Devshirme, such as the Aegean Islands and the Romanian lands. The same absence of conversion to Islam also characterized the experience of Jews who were exempted from the Devshirme throughout the empire. In summation, Although the Devshirme is not unknown, it is remarkably misunderstood. What is interesting about the Devshirme is not only its paradigmatic expression of the Ottoman system of separate and unequal, defined by religious privileges given by the state, rather than religious entitlement inherent to all peoples. What is especially interesting is that the Devshirme also functioned as an instrument of coercive Islamization. By recognizing this important but often overlooked aspect of the Devshirme, it becomes possible to understand the critical role that it played in producing direct, consequent Islamization and pressures that led indirectly to Islamization under Ottoman rule. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Doctor, for your profound presentation. To add that even if our theme here is tolerance in previous centuries, in these days of aggression in Europe, in the Middle East, and in Eastern Mediterranean, tolerance is having new weight in the public debate. So thank you again. Now we have Dr. Corlu Sant-Cassia, who is professor of anthropology in the University of Malta, got his PhD from Cambridge University. His first book with Konstantina Bada has the title "The Making of the Modern Greek Family," and also he was teaching in Paris 10, Nanterre, and Aix-en-Provence universities. He will speak about crypto-Christianity, matrimonial strategies, and fuzzy boundaries in Cyprus. So thank you, Dr. Cassia. Proceed.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Am I audible? Yes. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Well, I'd like to, first of all, of course, to thank very much the organizing committee for having invited me. I feel very honored to be here for all these very interesting papers. As the chairman pointed out, I am an anthropologist. I'm not really a historian. But I'd like to begin by pointing out that, or rather mentioning, that in the early 1980s Cyprus, one strand of popular Greek Cypriot discourse was that many Turkish Cypriots were either originally apostatized Christians, with whom, quote, we got on well in the past like brothers, prin pernusame kala sanadelphia, or that they were, quote unquote, naively Christian, despite being formerly Muslim. Another belief was that the Pontic Greeks who had recently migrated to Cyprus for work were not in fact Christians, but Greek-speaking Muslims. And whenever they got into trouble, the police would pull down their trousers to check the evidence, as it were. Now, both projections are inverted images of each other. The former, of past fraternal convivenza, overtaken by coeval sibling rivalry, vitiated by instrumentalized, often other nationalisms. The latter, a suspicion that others, our Pontic Greek, quote unquote, distant cousins, may be pretending to be kin, employing the currency of a long glorified ideology of chrétien malgré les musulmans in order to remain Turk malgré les Grecs. Now, the underlying common theme is that of the mirror. The other might be the monstrous double. But it also contains a lesson for scholars. Just as we can try to deconstruct the fictitious fixity of nationalist-inspired ethnicity identities, we should also be aware that our reconstructions of the past are subtly influenced by our contemporary political concerns. Thus, while certain Greek Cypriots may emphasize an original fraternal harmony, indeed common origins, to nudge towards a rapprochement of the Cyprus problem, others may point to the transfer of unruly and reluctant Anatolian peasants to Cyprus after the 1571 Ottoman invasion to both emphasize fundamental differences and to cast 1571 as a pre-run of the recent resettlements of mainland Greeks in the TRNC post-1974. So if ordinary Greek Cypriots draw selectively upon the past to construct contrasting understandings of their contemporary predicament, should we not also be aware of the analogous challenges that we as scholars face? Now, my concern is Islamization in Cyprus, and here I distinguish between modes of governance, the administrative classification and organization of populations, that is, the rights, duties, privileges, and modes of popular interaction, including in religious practices. I use the term fuzzy boundaries in my title because there is a well-known difference between the mode of governance in what Barkey called an empire of difference, which I sometimes call the Macedonian salad, in contrast to the post-Reconquista Spanish state, which I call the pressure cooker, and grassroots adaptations and indeed subversions of these modes of governance. If a polity is ruled through the regulation of unequal difference, it inevitably has two effects. First, difference based upon inequality can generate secrecy, or more precisely, can generate a desire in the subaltern as a weapon of the weak to expose the secrets of the dominant. This is particularly evident in popular competition over places of worship that I discuss in the latter part of my presentation. Second, an empire of unequal difference, as with gender identities amongst us until recently, invites both the initial blurring of differences and the subsequent conjuring of difference out of presumed similarity. And both invite accusations of opportunism. What may be an adaptation or even opportunism to overcome disadvantageous difference, which are two sides of the same coin, such as conversion, may well turn out to be a subversion, sometimes cognized, sometimes not. Consider the Cretan case. Soon after the Ottoman capture of Cyprus, 1 out of 3 marriages in Kolovos's samples united Muslim men, mainly Christian converts, to Christian brides. Formal conversion may lead to unintended consequences. Islam, as Lucet Valency reminds us, is the easiest world religion to enter, merely to recount the witness. And Bulliet noted the consequences. Quote, a convert first became a member of the Muslim community and later discovered or tried to discover what it meant to be a Muslim, unquote. Now, in agro-literate civilizations, identities are prescribed. You are either born into them or gain entry through conversion or marriage. For both Muslims and Christians, religious identity was inter alia a matrimonial matter, particularly of daughters and therefore of filiation. You give daughters to those whom you consider fundamentally like you to raise children in the customs of your ancestors. But conversion could have unintended consequences, and rather than a step to the future, may be an attempted recovery of the past. Some converted Jewish women in early modern Istanbul or ex-Christians in Crete subsequently married similar converted ex-co-religionists. The resulting marriage would clearly be a new single-faith one, but the employment of conversion to escape from a marriage and then remarry a similar ex-co-religionist through what I call legislative shopping could influence the religious upbringing and education of the offspring despite formal requirements. Were they purely, that is, formally Muslim, or practically quote-unquote crypto-Jewish or Christian? Balkan observers, such as Hasluck, noted that such marriages resulted in the transmission of aggregated, what he calls, religious practices. Similarly, mixed marriages between converted ex-dhimmi, that is what you could call neo-Muslim males, and dhimmi women, could have unanticipated consequences from the state's perspective, although perhaps more intentioned ones by the actors. What may have started as a mixed marriage, as an incremental step to social, political, and status mobility and full incorporation into the formerly dominant group, did not necessarily result in total abandonment of the original faith community. In these, what I call restorative or compensatory interfaith marriages, religious conversion of one of the parties precedes a mixed marriage with a member of the group one has left behind. Admittedly somewhat rare, they were found in specific niches. openly among settled contiguous communities, such as the countryside in Ottoman Cyprus, Crete, and the Balkans between Muslims and Christians, both Catholic and Orthodox, or more secretively, if we look across the other part of the Mediterranean, in post-Reconquista Majorca, uniting reluctant conversos desirous to retain links to their Jewish faith. So conversion of single men to Islam in the former or Christianity in the latter could be followed and mitigated by drawing spouses from their original religious community. In certain contexts, such as in post-Reconquista Majorca or Ottoman regions, such interfaith marriages could be quote-unquote renewed across generations, either by quote-unquote design, which is a favored post hoc explanation congruent with ethno-religious refabrications, or constraint, which I believe is much more the case, which is the limited range of available partners and exclusion by the dominant group. One effect was religious syncretism, often subsequently redefined as quote-unquote crypto faiths. In the nationalist late 19th century, they became troubling what one can call floating signifiers. Now, mixed marriages of Muslim men and Greek Orthodox women in Cyprus were, quote, certainly not uncommon, and it is evident from the judicial records, according to Jennings. There, again I quote, conversion of women to Islam might have been a means to escape from unhappy marriages. The converted women, whether previously married or not, easily found husbands, unquote, a practice that alarmed the Orthodox Church. And appeal to the Sharia courts was open to both Orthodox men and women, particularly over matrimonial matters, and this had precedence over the less accommodating Orthodox Church ones. Sharia courts thus offered divorce and remarriage strategies for both Orthodox men and particularly women who could seal or even facilitate such marriage dissolutions through religious conversion, though not always. In Ottoman Crete, Molly Green confirms the general trend that more Christian men converted than women, who did so to end the marriage or enter a new one. But a divorce from a Christian man and remarriage to a Muslim through a woman's conversion would not necessarily result in an Islamic education for the children, particularly daughters, of the new union, especially if the mother's knowledge of Islam was limited. In 1738, Pocock noted for Cyprus, quote, the Mahometan men very often marry with the Christian women and keep the fasts with their wives. Many of them are taught to be not adverse to Christianity, unquote. Although Islamic jurists were aware that conversion was an attractive route to obtain a divorce and tried to introduce various safeguards, these appear to have a limited effect, as did patriarchal complaints to exclude the Orthodox Christians from using the Sharia courts to obtain divorces. Now, in 1815, Cyprus, Turner observed, quote, many professed Muslims are in secret Greeks and observe all the numerous fasts of the church. All drink wine freely, and many of them eat pork without scruple in secret, a thing unheard of in Turkey. They frequently marry the Greek women of the island, as their religion permits a Turkish man to marry an infidel woman, etc. However, a different non-Orientalist interpretation should not be excluded. Not that the, quote, Muslims were, quote unquote, secret Greeks, that is, crypto-Christians, but that they were rather, quote unquote, bad Muslims. Similar doubts were aired also about the Black Sea crypto-Christian Michailidis. Now, mixed marriages in the Mediterranean tend towards two results which may be hard to distinguish clearly. The first is what Hasler calls the transmission of aggregated religious practices. As Dawkins noted, when a woman has a sick child to be cured, she is not likely to be particular about theology. Now, if the wives were Christian, of course, the priest could visit homes without incurring suspicion. Now, the second is towards the inculcation and transmission of gender-differentiated religious specialists, especially if daughters are retained within the group and not given in marriage to Paleo-Muslims, but to recent converts from the same ethnic groups. So whilst boys were oriented towards the men's world, that included the mosque and public Islam, and in time could take Paleo-Muslim wives, their sisters would be largely exposed through their mothers and the female world to more popular religious practices and intermarried with new inflows of neo-converts from the same ethnic group. In 1817 Crete, Zeber observed that, quote, the greater attachment of children of mixed marriages to the mother, quote, prepared them for the part they would have to play as Turks. Thus, a foundation is laid for an approximation to Christianity. Now, when the Black Sea quote-unquote, crypto-Christians declared themselves in the mid-19th century, and also the Lino-Vamvaki in Cyprus after 1878, their Muslim co-villagers were outraged, accusing them of being both opportunists and fake. They argued that they had intermarried with Muslims. The crypto-Christians denied the latter, that is, intermarriage, whilst tacitly acknowledging the former, opportunism, but not to exit the Muslim community, but to enter it originally, for else how could they assert their crypto-Christianity? Now, the only way to explain this intermarriage conundrum is to posit a matrimonial system of two concentric circles, an external exogamous one of sons taking Paleo-Muslim wives from the wider surrounding community, and an internal, more endogamous core of their sisters, preferentially intermarrying with either new inflows of apostatized Christians or with the sons of recent converts, that is, neo-Muslims, particularly those whose mothers were Christians and thus transmitting also Greek as the maternal language. Now, in taking neo-Muslim groups or grooms or their sons, these daughters' marriages would appear unproblematically quote-unquote Muslim, both formally and in terms of wider cultural sentiments. Now, to Muslims, wife takers are superior. To Christians, the reverse obtains. So sons' marriages into the wider Paleo-Muslim community confirmed their assertion of higher status, while daughters' marriages to neo-Muslims or / sons of Christians' mothers could appear as tacit confirmation of their lower social standing in Muslim eyes. But from a Christian perspective, this preferential endogamy, or more precisely, not giving their daughters to Paleo-Muslims, would appear to them as an expression of their self-ascribed superiority as wife-givers, or more precisely, wife-deniers. The groundwork, therefore, was being laid for a misrecognition. And my thing is basically about misrecognition. The other misrecognition lay in patterns of endogamy-exogamy. Given their small demographic size, crypto-Christians may have had to make some compromises to orthodox rules of exogamy, which is up to the 7th degree of consanguinity. In Islam, by contrast, first or close cousin marriage is permitted. Thus, to their Muslim co-villagers, the marriages of daughters of mixed marriages to their close kin would appear eminently quote-unquote Muslim. In short, in order to preserve their secrecy, quote-unquote crypto-Christians may well have been obliged to practice quote-unquote Muslim-type close-kin marriages rather than orthodox exogamous ones. Assuming respondents were not lying, intermarriages, rather than evidence of a single shared faith community, held different significances. From a crypto-Christian matricentrally oriented perspective, where bride givers have higher status, this difference was significant in that they only circulated their daughters within their subgroup. Ergo, their women, quote-unquote, never married the quote-unquote Turks, that is, Muslims. Cypriot, presumably male Lino-Vamvaki, jokingly referred to their prohibited pigs as their sympatheri, that is, their affines, condensing to the sobriquet a resolution to a triple taboo. One, their projection of their Muslim affines, or even Christian affines, with a tabooed or revived animal species that they themselves reared. Two, whose Paleo-Muslim daughters they married. And three, tabooed to them had their crypto-Christianity been openly flaunted. Now, if intermarriages may have been misrecognized, popular religious practices present an opposite phenomenon, which is the attribution of misrecognition to the other. Now, Gellner long ago brought to our attention that the dominant traditions in Christianity and Islam are mirror opposites. Christianity, especially its Greek Orthodox and Roman Catholic versions, are alike in that their continuous official traditions emphasize audiovisual aids to the divine, a plethora of semi-divine intermediaries, that is saints, in a hierarchical cosmology, a hierophany dispersed in material paraphernalia, sacred places and dreams, and divine access through the mediation of religious specialists rather than individual access to the book. Gellner called this Christianity Mark I. By contrast, Islam is its inverse. Its major continuous tradition is through the book, that is Islam Mark I, whilst its discontinuous tradition is popular and variable religious practices, Islam Mark II, rendering this latter like Christianity Mark I in its reliance on the incarnation of the Word. Put differently, a quote-unquote good Orthodox Christian would make a quote-unquote bad Muslim, if the latter relies on popular hierophanies, whilst a quote-unquote good Muslim relying on the text is a quote-unquote inadequate Orthodox, but potentially a quote-unquote good Protestant. We have the basis here of a fruitful social bringing together through a systematic misrecognition that nevertheless progresses not through its acceptance, but paradoxically through its denial. Now, if traditional Mediterranean production is characterized by their diversification, storage, and redistribution, the spiritual world is similarly patterned. Mutual accommodation by two legally differentiated religious groups, similar in their material conditions, illiteracy, and dependence on the consolations offered by magical protection and cures, encouraged a reciprocal frequentation of sacred sites and holy individuals, for, quote, from Hasluck, religious prejudice succumbs to the desire of healing, unquote. Each group retains its belief in its own sacra, but countenances alternatives in extremis. In turn, recourses to the sacra of others confirms the latter's estimation of the transcendental power of their site, relic, practice, or personage. So extensive was this intermingling that in 1760s Larnaca, Cyprus, Mariti could not easily decide whether a joint place of worship, which was called Ibn Arab, was a chapel or a mosque. If, as Hasluck noted, the difference between a Mohammedan and a Christian saint thus reduces itself largely to a matter of names, unquote, here even the appellation was shared. Now, more than mutual accommodation is at play in such a system. As shrines cannot satisfy all applicants, a mixed religious system does two things. First, it encourages the competitive production of sacred signs by religious entrepreneurs from the poorer levels of society. Second, it realizes this through the display of quote-unquote revealed secrets, or more precisely, revelations that conjure quote-unquote secrets, things hidden, an icon or sacred book revealed through a dream, identities concealed, or origins misrecognized. So pervasive was this mercurial competitive metamorphism that in Muslim accounts, Christian hermits revealed themselves at deathbed confessions as crypto-Muslims, attracting new Muslim pilgrims to a pre-existing Christian site, whilst Christian supplicants to a miracle-producing Muslim sanctuaries justified their participation by quote-unquote discovering an original Christian connection and fabricating a suitable legend. And in crypto-Christian stories, Hodjas are secretly ordained priests by archbishops. We are in the presence of a mimetic desire born out of insecurity, so great and ambiguous that difference is obliterated through appropriation of spiritual filiation and of the fetishization of things hidden as epiphanic and an aestheticized mode of being. Consider Mariti's observations in 1960s on the origins of a subsequently famous Cypriot Muslim shrine, the Tekke of Haram. And I'm going to quote over here. In the early years of the 18th century, a dervish of a speculative term discovered and dug out a commonplace Muslim tomb and thought it might be a profitable business to inspire the shepherds who fed their flocks thereabouts with a veneration for the place. Old Cypriot Christians, and this is what I emphasize, assert that it was he who, in furtherance of this project, circulated the story of miracles performed at the tomb, unquote. Now, Mariti's demystification through the disclosures of skeptical contemporaries seems reasonable to our modern sensibilities. An unveiling is performed through a rationalist, quote-unquote, Christian exposure of Muslim fabrications of counterfeit miracles. Yet, as Tausig cautions, all along revelation was part of the secret, unquote. That may seem like the end of the revelation until we realize that Mariti himself was a Catholic prelate propagating an orthodox exposure of quote-unquote Muslim credulity, unquote. And in a semi-Orientalist condescension, Harry Luke noted long ago that Cypriot Christians and Muslims expressed a repugnance towards the formal tenets of each other's belief, but they took not unkindly to each other's superstitions. In short, they tolerated, indeed, quote-unquote, exposed each other's beliefs as quote-unquote superstitions, while holding fast to their own sacred beliefs. Now, all traditional belief contains a kernel of doubt, the motor of its ceaseless reinvention. When the efficacy of one's intermediaries inevitably disappoints and the desperation cannot be overcome, religious prejudice, in inverted commas, succumbs to turning towards the reciprocally culturally constructed quote-unquote fake of the other. As Tausig intuits, the fakeness of the fake and its inauthenticity turns out to be not easily settled, particularly, end quote, when the exposure of one religious belief by another is propagated by yet a third. Now, some, though not all, examples of Christianity could thus have been embedded and pursued through popular religious practices qua Muslims that imbricated with Christian ones. It is not enough to point to folkloric practices as evidence of belief. Ottoman crypto-Christianity survived not through sacred texts, although literacy was an important means to Ottoman incorporation and Islamization. It survives through, one, its transmission as practice from mothers to daughters together with the language, two, parallel Christian rites of passage, three, the simple sanctuary, such as a cave or a house niche, for devotional expression merely requires a rudimentary icon, a candle stand, and a capnisteri. And four, devotional and healing visits to sacred personage and sites. The latter two dissolved into folk, brotherhood, or heterodox non-scriptural Islams. Crypto-Christian claims to intentional, sustained public dissimulation, primarily to sustain a faith, it seems to me, is not 100% convincing, although this does not exclude Christian rituals such as baptisms, etc., realized in domestic private contexts. After scrutiny, Deringil asks with disarming candor, is it totally unreasonable to speculate that the Istavri or the Kromnides actually sincerely believed in both the religions? Now, this legitimate question could perhaps be disentangled. In what sense were they, quote-unquote, both? Hasluck suggests that mutual interpenetrations of Christian and Islamic practices were so pervasive that classification according to orthodoxy and orthopraxy is well nigh impossible. And it was these types of mutual penetrations and misrecognitions that rendered the redrawing of religious boundaries in the late 19th century particularly problematical. So I shall stop over here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can I share my screen?
Yes.
Okay.
I wanted to thank the professor for his enlightening speech and for his addressing the Cyprus issue with great sensibility. And now, last but not least, is Zeynep Türkyilmaz from the University of Potsdam, the Global History Program. She was also an assistant professor of history at Dartmouth College, and she got her PhD from the University of California. So, Doctor, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. I can still, it's disabled, so I can't really share my screen. Could you enable the sharing, please? Okay, thank you very much for the very kind invitation and putting me on this great panel. I have quite many questions and comments in the Q&A session myself, so I'm really looking forward to it. And today I'm actually going to talk about two communities that I worked. Let me start the, sorry. Two communities that I worked from my dissertation onwards, and unfortunately became a popular subject, a popular community after their, especially the Ezidis, after their persecution in the hands of ISIS in 2014, and they are still have quite a few members missing. So today I'm going to talk on these two communities, and I thank you for the other speakers who actually said so much about the Ottoman system. So I'm not really going into the details of what millet system was, or what the discourse of tolerance or coexistent man in the Ottoman context. But let me begin by saying that both communities occupied a very curious position within the whatever definition of millet system existed or implemented in the pre-19th century Ottoman Empire. So there are lots of debates about whether millet system was really a system that was implemented, especially in the countryside. Regardless of that, these two communities, and I can add several others actually to this, but for today's talk, these two communities occupied a really curious position. Ezidis particularly had a very strong anti-Muslim, anti-Islam stance from the very beginning. From the very beginning, I'm referring to their experiences under the Ottoman rule, and were not obviously recognized as a protected community, given that they were not part of the Abrahamic tradition, and they denied it very clearly. So one of the things that we know about the Ezidi experiences before 19th century is the intermittent persecutions they suffered. But also I will have to add here that their history was not only limited to persecutions, but they also had the means to protect themselves. And that's how they actually survived several persecutions and survived all the way to the 19th century as a community that can be identifiable and different from their other communities surrounding this non-conforming group. Here I provide a quote from Evliya Çelebi, one of the interesting figures of the 17th century, a traveler, known for his exaggeration, but apparently he was on one of the military operations targeting the Ezidis, and as you see here clearly, he categorizes them as infidels, and he talks not about a victim community, but a very aggressive, a very powerful community that attacked and had power and had wealth, right? So the other community that I'll talk about, Kızılbaş Alevis, and I refer to them as Kızılbaş because that was the language that was the category used for them until the 19th century. Here I am quoting actually Ebu Suud, one of the jurists and very famous Sheikhul Islam in the 16th century. And basically, when referring to, and this is the time of persecutions for Kızılbaş as well, particularly due to wars with the Safavid Empire, Kızılbaş were a little bit different from Ezidis. They didn't always had very clear and radical anti-Islamic discourse or anti-Islamic stance, but they had a radical reading of some of the extremist Shia figures incorporated into their tradition. So rather than totally being considered as, clearly being considered as infidels that we see consistently regarding Ezidis, Kızılbaş, especially during the military operations, during the persecutions that they suffered, especially until 19th century, they are categorized as apostates. Those who made, as I quote from the Ebu Suud here, who make light of Quran, who makes, make light of religion of Islam, curse the caliphs, except Ali, disrespect the ulema. So these two communities, although were not clearly considered part of the Ehli Kitab or coming from the Abrahamic tradition, but occupied in a way different but stressful and strained relation with the center when it comes to mutually recognizing each other. So both communities, especially from 20th century onwards, when they remember, when they talk about their past, they always talk about their resistance. They always talk about how they differ themselves from the center. And in the archival sources, we can also see a similar perspective, but we know that at least they were not identical in terms of their relation to the Ottoman center. Today, I'll talk mostly about the 19th century and their religious mobility among these two communities that I argue were not only comparable. We'll see that they were influenced by similar changes taking place in the Ottoman Empire, similar forces that pushed them to make choices and produce policies and in a way respond. But also looking from the state's perspective, I will try to argue that the policies implemented in one community also was constitutive of policies developed for the other community. Not in the same way, but the Ottoman center always had kind of an comparative and constitutive approach when it comes to these non-conforming communities. So like Professor Kyrou discussed about the issue of tolerance, Tanzimat Imperial Edict of 1839 also has a very favorable take among the scholars, right? It's also remembered and written about very favorably by scholars, by basically saying that it was a text that under pressure, but still the Ottoman Sultan recognized the equality of subjects. First of all, it doesn't. I mean, in terms of the text, it doesn't recognize equality, but it actually, for the communities I'm talking about today, it brought a lot of optimism, expectation, like many of the subjects of the Ottoman Empire. But more than those optimism, it ended up creating new structures that in the long run took away the survival mechanisms that made these communities persist throughout centuries, right? So in a way, what I'll try to demonstrate in my talk, with the 19th century reforms, we see an unprecedented interest in the Ottoman center to assimilate and Islamize these communities, whereas in the earlier centuries, we see sporadic persecutions of this community, but not necessarily their Islamization or their assimilation, right? So very significantly, the promise of equality and the structures that created, in a way, modern forms of citizenship did not improve the lives of these communities. Conversely, ironically, actually weakened them and made them susceptible to state-induced policies of assimilation and further persecution. So what were some of these policies or some of these ideas that was introduced with 1839? Obviously, some form of Ottoman citizenship known as Osmanlılık was one of the ideas, but we'll come to that later on. Regularized taxation, universal conscription, the census, and census came with the question of confessional categories. Perhaps for the first time in their communal history under the Ottoman rule, these communities have to give an answer to who they were. Because pejoratively or not, and I argue that actually that applies to crypto-Christians as well in the earlier periods, these communities did not really need to clarify their identities. So they were Ezidis, and that was explanatory enough to themselves and to their neighboring communities as well as the Ottoman officials. But with the 1839, that introduced, as I said, especially conscription, universal conscription, and census that was required for the implementation of that conscription throughout the empire, you had to give an answer that had to fit one of those categories. Right? And those acceptable categories were the ones that were clarified in the millet system, right? That came from the Abrahamic tradition. So between 1839 and I would say 1860s, actually both of these communities tried to make claims for an identity that did not fit into the categories that were available on the census data. So Ezidis particularly, although they had just suffered severe persecutions in just in the eve of Tanzimat reforms and lost in certain areas 3/4 of their population. I mean, it was a really 3 consecutive persecutions over a decade. They tried to claim an Ezidi identity on the book to be recognized officially as Ezidis. And although Ottoman officials were somewhat willing to discuss that initially, we see that that initial reform optimism did not sustain very long, and slowly it faded into some sort of conservative approach and conservative response that basically did not let them to choose any of those categories, but affixed them and ascribed on them only and only an Muslim identity. From 1840s onwards, discussion of whether Kızılbaş and the Ezidis were bad Muslims, using Professor Sant-Cassia's terminology, were bad Muslims or not, became one of the arguments, one of the main issue of debates among the Ottoman officials, right? So what did these communities do? As I said, they tried to claim a different identity, but they also began to question their identities. Who are we really? If these are the categories of religion, this is the way to be in the 19th century, are we really one of those? So one of the answers given, at least by some members of their community, was getting in touch with the Protestant missionaries, particularly American missionaries. And you see that American Protestant missionaries were also very interested, especially interested and impressed by the Kızılbaş communities, and went as far as saying that, you know, they must be one of those lost tribes of Christianity, and they are very much like old Christians, but under the pressures of the Muslims, they are kind of crypto-Armenians, crypto-Christians, because what other option they had. So actually the map, one of the earlier maps providing the spread of Kızılbaş, especially Kurdish-speaking Kızılbaş, was drawn by an American missionary, Mr. Dunmore, who met Kızılbaş communities and was very much impressed. And actually there were conversions among the Kızılbaş to Protestantism, and they were pejoratively referred to as prots by their Kızılbaş ex-co-religionists, who basically came up with similar kind of libel stories about how they were incestuous and they were not morally straight, but these communities, I mean, some of these groups really went as far as claiming that identity, and they had very long-term actually implications for the community itself. Similarly, and not surprisingly, Ezidis also opted for getting in touch with the Protestant missionaries. And here I think I should really clarify, for the Ezidis, this was more of a strategic move than it was for the Kızılbaş, right? And they were threatened by yet another persecution, and they hoped that at least getting in touch with the missionaries who had ties to the British and the American authorities would perhaps provide them some sort of security. In 1873, Ezidis, failing to get any kind of security or safety or protection from the Ottoman Empire as Ezidis, made another declaration and submitted that to the embassies, consulates, and also we assume that also gave a copy to the Ottoman Empire, clarifying for the first time to outsiders what the tenets of their religious belief was. And obviously, I mean, scholars discuss the authenticity of those documents. And this is on the left, you see the signatures of those who supported this text, and I can clearly at least recognize some of the names as significant members of the Ezidi committee. And here they talk about how, I mean, they cannot go to the military service because they cannot wear the blue color, which is the color of the uniform. They cannot intermix with Muslims. So this is the first time actually they really need to in a way open up their secrecy, which was again against their own tradition and belief. So for the time constraint, I'll go very fast, and if any clarification needed, I can always answer that in Q&A. So between 1839 and 1876, at least there was some sort of some room for activism and dialogue and religious mobility for these communities. From 1876, under the rule of Abdülhamit II, which is known as the Red Sultan, particularly for the persecution for the pogrom suffered by the Armenians under his rule, we see that actually the discourse about universal citizenship or whatever equality was promised to the entire, all subjects of the Ottoman Empire was somewhat left aside, and we see reinstatement of hierarchy within the Ottomans model, right? And we also see, and I'll give the examples of that, so that's why I'm passing very quick. So Muslim supremacy, I'm saying Sunni, but it's not really necessary. It was the Muslim supremacy, clearly Muslim supremacy, was created at this time. It is redefined as an defensive, as a victimized identity that needs to be reinstated and liberated from the imperialist pressures. Might sound very familiar, yeah, but this was Abdülhamit II. So these two communities, besides others who were religiously mobile and did not really fit again the categories of the empire, like the crypto-Christians who were struggling to register themselves as Christians, were labeled as heretic and ignorant. So if they are heretic, the options is, according to Islam, I mean, heretics can be killed. Since they cannot really kill these heretics in the 19th century, another label was added to that, and that was that they are ignorant. So they need to be educated and claim back to the Islamic tradition, which they had lived centuries ago due to their ignorance, right? So regardless of what Ezidis claimed in their tenets or however Kızılbaş defined themselves, they could not claim a separate identity anymore. They were ignorant Muslims who needed to be reintroduced to the light of Islam. So unlike in the previous centuries, under the Abdülhamit II, these communities, the existence of these communities as they were in the form of heresy and ignorance was a question of security. So had to be dealt with force and violence, right? And school and mosque, almost every document talking about these communities under the Abdülhamit II's rule talks about introduction of schools and mosques and sending men of religion to turn them into their real self, right? Reintroduce and gain them back to their original self. So besides these obviously text and formulations, there were real people. And who were these real people? Obviously, Abdülhamit II was not taking these decisions or thinking about these policies by himself. Two significant figures I have to bring up today. One is Mehmet Memduh Pasha, who served as governor of Konya, Sivas, and Ankara, was a very notorious figure, particularly for the Istaviotes. He was obsessed with them, and he was the one who actually ordered their exile. After 1894, he was promoted based on his success with these communities. He was promoted to be the Minister of Interior, and he served until the end of the rule of Abdülhamit II. He was very clearly anti-Christian, and he was very clearly anti-Kızılbaş, anti-Istavriot, anti-crypto-Christian, and he didn't hesitate to fabricate testimonies against them, fabricate crime, and then prosecute. And there are actually cases of that, very clear cases of that at the Ottoman archives. The second one was Müşir Ahmet Şakir Pasha, who died rather early, but he was the one who came up with the institutions that made differential citizenship, that in a way created institutions that recognized the supremacy and privileges of the Muslim communities once again after decades of confusion and perhaps liberalism in their own definition. So what were the institutions he created? I'll come back to that one. Tribal troops. That was again, most of the people are familiar with the tribal troops in the killings of Armenians, especially in 1890s under Abdülhamit II. Tribal troops were troops that were recruited among raised from the Muslim tribes. They are mostly known as Kurds, but they were not only Kurds. They were not only recruited from among the Kurdish troops, but Circassian, Caucasian, recent refugees, and also Arab Muslim tribes. But the emphasis is that this was a specific military organization that was exclusively armed by the Sunni Muslims, who were once again clearly defined as reliable subjects of the empire, meaning that the others were not reliable. And once again, especially in the countryside, the Muslim tribes were being armed that can be used on the other communities that perhaps define themselves non-Muslim or not. And both Ezidis and the Kızılbaş communities, especially Kızılbaş communities in the district of Dersim, reacted to that. And quite interestingly, rather than objecting to this kind of militarization and refusal that that they are not going to serve in the Ottoman army, or they are not going to not hold arms as they did with the previous issues of conscription, as they used this language in the previous universal conscription, they opted that, and they sent several petitions to be accepted to the tribal troops. And quite interestingly and quite neatly, they were denied on the basis that religiously they were not reliable, so they cannot be recruited into the tribal troops, which again, once again, reshuffled the regional hierarchies, and whatever strategies, especially in the case of Ezidis, that allowed them resist not only the Ottoman states' intrusion, but also their neighbors' attack in the previous centuries, in a way became impossible with them holding arms that were granted to them by the Ottoman modern arms by the Ottoman center. So one of the strategies, at least by some Ezidi tribesmen, was to convert to Islam. And join the tribal troops. And the one here on the left of my screen and has the numbers, and it says Ibrahim Pasha's youngest son. And here we know that. I can't quite read the bottom. Oopsie, sorry. What's very famous Ezidi Sheikh Hüseyin Kancu was one of the men that was next to Ibrahim Pasha throughout his operations as tribal troops. Dersimlis, or the Kızılbaş Kurds, on the other hand, did not opt for conversion and being part of this, and remained outside. What they really tried to get into was a tribal school. Again, several petitions to be part of the tribal school, and obviously this meant they understood that by going into the tribal school, their sons would be Ottoman officials and high-ranking Ottoman officials, and part of that would be perhaps Sunnification or Islamization, but part of that also means that perhaps keeping a different disguise and keeping a different inner, they can in a way benefit their own community. But this policy also clearly waived the assimilation and changes taking place in the configuration of these communities' relation within themselves and with the center. We can really see a massive persecution that targeted the Kızılbaş in the 19th century, but Ezidis were not as lucky. And especially in right around the discussions of tribal troops, Ömer Vehbi Pasha, who was the commander of the 6th Army based in Baghdad, started an operation and sent the good news that Ezidis once suddenly decided to come to the light of Islam and declare themselves as Muslims, and now need schools and mosques among them so that they can relearn their original religion. And soon after that, actually a few months after that, a group of Ezidi deputations came to the city, carrying with them, if I'm not wrong, 7 heads separated from the body, and described how Ömer Vehbi Pasha actually beheaded their leaders and some others who resisted, who did not accept Islamization of the conversion to Islam. And he killed around 100 Ezidis by simply beheading them, right? So this is a very symbolic way of implementing violence, not just killing, but beheading them and leaving these heads with the community, showing once again that this is heresy and this is how heretics are punished. So all throughout this period, we see waves of persecution among Ezidi, persecution and also concomitant Islamization among Ezidis, who could not, in a way, resist the intrusion of the state, but also pressures coming from their neighbors. So let me sum up. I'm sure I used my time generously. So what did the end of the empire mean for these communities? Especially with 1908, yet another period of optimism that many scholars said at least promised liberty, equality, and brotherhood for the communities who were given the chance to speak for themselves, right? We all see these multilingual posters that share the flags and symbols of different religions and different ethnic communities. But interestingly, this optimism did not last very long. I would say after the first 8 months or 9 months, especially with the coup that removed Abdülhamid II from his office, we see that ironically, there was a return to the policies developed under Abdülhamid II by the bureaucrats I just mentioned. So initially, Ezidis hoped that they could be registered as Ezidis. And we see that actually after the 31st March incidents, they were repeatedly denied to be accepted as Ezidis, and a very similar discourse about how they should be introduced to the religion, and how mosques and schools should be opened among them, so that they will be, again, enlightened, thus no more ignorant, thus no more heretical. So Kızılbaş were not persecuted in the similar manner, but they became an object of ethnographic curiosity to liberate them from the discourses of especially evangelical missionaries, which they believed, which the Ottoman officials believed, in a way deceived them, and in a way, with their fluidity of their beliefs and their confused ideas about religion, this missionary intrigue in a way made them susceptible not only to the ideas about their religion, but they also developed an affinity with the Armenians, and some of them believe that they are converted Armenians. So in a way, this ethnographic curiosity was instrumentalized in a way to claim them back to Islam, and later on in the Republican period, actually into the Turkishness. So in this period, no more punitive, but destructive and foundational violence. And what I mean here is, in the previous eras, you see violence used as a means of destruction, right? You kill them and you leave them. But here it's considered as a transformative force, right? Those who remained had to convert, had to assimilate, or had to claim a different identity, whether outwardly or not. This violence was actually a transformative violence. Final words about eco-citizenship. So it's a long century of discussions about citizenship, identity. I would extend it actually to the recent century as well. So 200 years of talking about what it meant to be non-conforming or non-Christian or Muslim in the Middle East. So for these communities, all the reforms were moments of optimism, but all these moments of optimism somehow faded into a structural assimilation, more empowerment of the state forces, and removal of survival strategies for these communities. In a way, ironically, equal citizenship did not mean more liberty or more identity, or more opportunity to be themselves, however they defined it at different points, but more pressure and more structure and more means for the state to turn these non-conforming subjects into their desired identities or desired subjects for the security of the state. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor, for your vivid and knowledge for the presentation. Now we have only 3 or so minutes for a question if there is from the audience. If not, I consider this session fruitful. I hope that you find it in the same indeed as well. I don't see that we have any questions, so let's go for an intermission of some minutes, and then we will come back with our 5th session. Thank you so much. Thank you, Pastor.
Well, could we have at some point a discussion? Because I particularly liked the papers.
Yeah, I actually had a question for Professor Sant-Cassia.
Okay.
Can I? Or do you want to go ahead?
Yes, please proceed.
So thanks for me.
Well, perhaps I could just make an observation. I very much enjoyed your paper, Zeynep, because it seemed to me it's very interesting. An empire can leave people on the periphery, but a modern state doesn't needs people to be themselves. And it's ironic. I mean, it makes me think of Oscar Wilde, who once said, "Be yourself, everybody else is already taken." Well, these guys couldn't even be themselves.
Yeah.
I mean, so it's ironic. I mean, in other words, it actually does show, I mean, the greater power and indeed a greater oppressive power of the modern state, if it is utilizing the categories which they've inherited. In other words, not so much citizenship, but belonging to a religious group. I mean, it's an ethnogenesis, but they couldn't even have a create an ethnogenesis.
Yeah, I mean, quite interesting, right? The very moment that the discourse of liberty comes, it's actually totally taken away, right? The whole thing about freedoms and whatever, how much that existed, disappears. Actually, my question to you was a kind of a continuation. So you make this comparative approach between the Cypriot and Black Sea. So I have this very special fondness for the Black Sea ones.
Sure you do.
I spent quite a few years studying them. So, so do you assume that they were similar? I mean, what necessitated their quote-unquote secrecy, whatever that meant for them? That they were similar, because there was that kind of an scholarship, that kind of approach to these communities. Or do you think perhaps there is some room for understanding them locally?
No, I'm sure that there was. I mean, there was, I can't remember who it was, an English scholar who divided all these crypto-Christians, and he talks about, he divides them, I think, into about 6 or 7 or 8 groups. And he, I mean, according to Anthony Breyer, one of the reasons why the crypto Christians were sort of, one of the reasons was their mining concessions. He gives it an economic basis. In other words, he basically says they wanted to control some sort of mining concessions, which I think had changed because of the move of the creation of new routes.
Actually, he says that he doesn't actually, I mean, he mentions mines, but he says actually that they were opportunists.
They were?
Opportunists.
Oh, opportunists. Well, I mean, that's the problem. Yeah. Everybody can be accused of being an opportunist.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think even in Greece itself, the Greeks themselves had difficulties in figuring out whether they were supposedly good Christians or bad Muslims.
Perhaps they were not.
Yeah, okay, yes, exactly. Yes, exactly.
Paul, Zeynep, this is Alex. I'm being very mindful of the time. I see we've reached 1 o'clock, and you'll have to forgive me. I'm going to bow out. I'm actually still teaching, and I'm late for a 1 o'clock seminar. Thank you for your presentations.
Thank you, too. Thank you.
Loukas, thank you very much, and please forgive me for departing now.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We come back in 10 minutes.
Αγαπητέ, έχεις ήχο.
I'd like to welcome you to this next session. We're going to start directly with the second speaker. The first one, Nikos Michailidis, will be speaking tomorrow. And so I'm inviting Professor Axel to speak to us about the Ottoman Conquest narrative and Islamization, building a conceptual framework as reflected in the utilization of monuments. The floor is yours, Professor Jordan.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Good. I can barely hear you. That's why I wanted to make sure. I think the microphone is a little far away, but okay. Let me share my screen with you. Let's see. Oh, we can't share the screen, it says.
One moment.
Sure.
We're ready.
There we go. Can we share from beginning? Let's see. Start from beginning. Did it start? No. Okay. All right. You can see the screen, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone, for coming. And I've enjoyed some of the previous presentations as well. What I have to present today is slightly different in terms of its perspective. It's not as specific and focused on one single aspect of Islamization, but rather it's about the public discussion and how we as scholars have a role in that public discussion, in that framework. And I'm doing this through the utilization of monuments, how meanings are expressed via monuments and how they are perceived. And I'll talk about a number of different things. I'll talk about the Ottoman and Byzantine uses. I'll talk about how the Ottomans formulate conquest. I will talk about how this idea of conquest changes over time and how Islamization itself is not a monolithic idea. And then I will tie this to more modern ideas of conquest, including things such as neo-Ottomanism and so on, and see how we have an impact on these debates. So the title I put here is The Ottoman Conquest Narrative and Islamization, Building a Conceptual Framework for Public Debate. I just added that because it's too long if we use that for the actual title, as reflected in the utilization of monuments. Let's begin with, basic conceptual work here. As we've seen in this conference as well, and elsewhere, of course, there's no single definition of Islamization during the Ottoman period. There are multiple Islamizations, and hence, of course, that's probably why in our title we have the plural Islamizations. There are multiple threads going through it. It's not a uniform phenomenon, and it happens at multiple levels in different ways, and it's not defined in one way, which is just fine as far as I'm concerned. One problem with in public debate and how Islamization is understood in public debate is that we don't have a text, let's say, for if we were studying, for example, Italian fascism. How would we study Italian fascism? Well, we can look at its own documents. There's a good set of documents defining what fascism is, and then we can sort of use it and compare and contrast with the reality that we see in terms of practices, and that gives us a solid base. With Islamization in the Ottoman Empire, we don't really have anything like that. We don't have a nice self-described. Here is what we're doing, and we call this Islamization type of deal. We are the ones from 600 years beyond. Trying to give meaning to the term. As far as how the Ottomans themselves viewed it, they rarely talk about Islamization as such. Of course, they do have many Islamic elements. They utilize Islamic narrative in the conquest itself, but the more prominent element is conquest. Conquest is what they are focusing on. And as conquest goes, wherever it is useful for them to use Islamic concepts, they use them. Where it's not so useful, well, they adapt. And that brings us to the monuments. I will talk about 3 monuments here, all of them in Constantinople, and see how the Ottomans treat those monuments, for example. The first one is, of course, the Hagia Sophia. And it had and still has tremendous symbolic value for a whole bunch of different people. It is still used as a tool of politics, unfortunately, perhaps. But let's go one by one with the Hagia Sophia. Now I'm going to put on my sort of Byzantinist hat here, and that's something that I've observed over time, by the way. It used to be, until relatively recently, I would say, that most Byzantine scholars did not really engage with Ottoman historiography, and most Ottoman scholars did not really engage with Byzantine historiography. There were exceptions to this, but this was the rule. It's slightly changing now, but this is worth observing. And I think that's a problem. I think that there needs to be more common ground. As someone who does both, I can definitely see the advantages in doing so. So in the case of the Hagia Sophia, when it was built, of course it had religious significance. It would be incredible to suggest it did not have religious significance. It is, of course, the seat of the patriarch, and it is, of course, a tremendous investment on the part of Justinian, and so on and so forth. But is that the only significance of the Hagia Sophia? After all, the Byzantines did have significant churches. They had Hagia Irini before that, built before that. And certainly the Hagia Sophia was a first in terms of its size, in terms of how imposing it was. So usually when I do this in a classroom and I talk about Byzantine Constantinople and tell my students, how to imagine these things, I always tell them, imagine you are coming into the city, into Constantinople, throughout most of the periods in its 1,000-year history under the Byzantines. You enter the city through, if you're entering it through the land side, through the Theodosian walls, through a gate. You go through these, broad, roads. You go through various sounds, smells, all of them are unique to you, of course, as a traveler. Then you eventually reach, if you go far enough towards the east-southeast, you reach the Hippodrome, a gigantic building, the likes of which you probably have not seen, or you've seen in ruins if you're coming from the west. Then you see the Hagia Sophia. Imagine the impact of a building like that. You approach it, you're a tiny little human being compared to this gigantic building. If you enter it, you see even more riches inside. Just a single arch, I used to say, and I had actually did a basic calculation of this. If you compare the amount of work, materials, and money that went into a single arch within the Hagia Sophia, you're looking at basically the treasury of an entire European kingdom at the time. So you're looking at a very imposing structure. And of course, you can see all the effects of all this in travelers' accounts throughout Byzantine history, how they're awed by the Hagia Sophia. And that's where part of the message of the Hagia Sophia is. It's not just about pure religion. I don't know what that would be. Of course, there's nothing like pure religion. Religion is always connected to culture and politics. But it's also, I tell them, a sort of imperial fist. This is the might of the empire. It's not just religion. It's combined with empire itself. It's an imperial message. So compare that to something like the Hippodrome and what the Ottomans do to it. The city is conquered, the Ottomans immediately convert the Hagia Sophia to a mosque. Not a surprise, that's the most prominent building, it has tremendous significance. Of course, they convert it to a mosque. But what do they do to the Hippodrome? It was not in function at that point, it was not in good shape. Various accounts say that it was in ruins, but we don't know the extent to which it was in ruins. Obviously, a good chunk of it was still standing. The Ottomans don't really touch it. They don't demolish it, but they don't do anything with it either. All the way until several centuries later, we have the building of the Sultanahmet Mosque right by it, which still stands today. And during the excavation of that mosque, all the land being excavated and the construction debris is piled onto where the Hippodrome was. So you eventually end up only with the southern edge of the Hippodrome surviving, the Svendon, which you can still see today in terrible shape, unfortunately. But that's another approach the Ottomans had to a monumental building in their city. They did not use it in any way. They did not see the utility of it in any way. Then we look at a third example, what is now the Fatih Mosque. There used to be another Fatih Mosque if you go back to the 15th century, but originally, of course, that site was the Church of the Holy Apostles. It was the second church after Hagia Sophia in the city, extremely important site. It was the place where most of the emperors were buried. And by the time of the conquest, it was in bad shape. All kinds of travelers talk about this. But nonetheless, for a number of years after the conquest of the city by Mehmet II, it was used as the seat of the patriarchate, the Orthodox patriarchate. So it's not as if it was in complete ruins or anything like that. Eventually, though, the patriarchate moves from there, and the Ottomans take it, and instead of converting it, they demolish it completely and build Fatih Mosque in its place, which eventually is also replaced by a more modern version after it's damaged. So here we have 3 monumental buildings in one city with 3 different approaches. I'm going into these details here because I want to say that the Ottomans did not have a uniform approach. They did not have this sort of monolithic approach to conquest, to how they viewed these buildings and so on. In the case of the Hagia Sophia, there's obvious symbolic value to it. Obviously, there's tremendous value in making it a mosque, so they did it. It's very functionalist, very utilitarian, very pragmatic in an imperial message sense. But they didn't always do that everywhere. Which brings us, that's another picture of that. Sorry, I skipped it as I was talking about the imperial message. So it's an imperial message for the Ottomans as well in that sense. Now, in the use of the Ottomans of the site, we know several things. One, that the mosaics inside were not immediately covered. That's a later phenomenon. It didn't happen immediately. And this is in fact part of the modern day debate, current debate, on how, when it was reconverted into a mosque relatively recently, how the mosaics, of course, are covered during times of prayer and so on, and then they are opened up with a mechanism. We'll talk more about that in a minute. As far as the Ottomans' use of the Hagia Sophia, though, it went well for a while with their message. When you look at it at the top, at the level of the imperial dynasty, we all know, of course, that Ottoman sultans assumed the title of Roman emperor, of Caesar, that they wanted to present themselves to the world, both to their subjects and to the world outside, as the continuation of Rome. To which extent they actually believed this is still a matter of debate, and there's no clear-cut answer there, but they certainly utilized it extensively until we reach a certain point in history. Eventually, it declines in use. That brings us to a major element of all this conquest narrative, how things are described, and how Islamization and conversions are perceived in the Ottoman Empire. This doesn't just affect the public debate, it also is found in academic debates among scholars. And this argument is that, to simplify it, the Ottomans were very tolerant toward their subjects when it came to religion, that they did not force anyone for mass conversions, that everything was, comparatively speaking, in better shape compared to the rest of the world, and so on. And as I said, it's not limited to the public. When I was studying Ottoman history, after having done some Byzantine history with my late mentor, now Donald Quatter, who was an Ottoman historian, even he said, well, you know, when you look at the Ottomans and how they treated their, non-Muslim population, it was better than what you will see and you would have seen in most of the other parts of the world. And we had long debates about this, whether this was the case and so on. His approach was not very one-dimensional, let's be fair about that, but there are people who also have very one-dimensional approach in this, and there's a political value in talking about this tolerance that the Ottomans had. I've even come across scholars in publications as well as documentaries talking about something like the devşirme system by which Janissaries were created as this sort of wonderful system whereby, children were taken from the families and given wonderful education, after which they had great careers. Some of them went into the bureaucracy and rose in the bureaucracy, others were soldiers and so on. And this was something that was the envy, and it was wonderful and so on. And few people actually even mentioned that going to people and taking their children away so that they'll never see them, and then converting them to Islam, and then creating something out of that is not exactly the most desirable outcome from the perspective of the people who experience it. So tolerance is a political argument. The whole Ottoman tolerance thing is a political argument, and it has power behind it, and we have to be watchful for that. Now, when we look at the monuments, it is also, in actuality, for the Ottomans themselves, it is, as I said, functional and pragmatic. think about the empire in the 15th and up to the early 16th centuries. This is an empire that has a majority of its people who are non-Muslim. That's not a small thing. How are you, from the perspective of the ruling dynasty, how are you going to rule an empire if you go ahead and try to, somehow impose this idea of, conversions, mass conversions, and Islamization everywhere by force and so on and so forth? You can't do that. Even if you wanted to do it, you cannot govern an empire like that. Not to mention, the way that these buildings are converted is more or less formulaic. You can say that sometimes it's ad hoc, sometimes it's formulaic. In the case of Ioannina, for example, which you have here in the third item, that's a 15th century Ottoman conquest, that region. It was not conquered by force. It was not the result of a war or a siege or something like that. It was by agreement. And part of that agreement resulted in this decree, meaning that the Ottomans could not take any of the churches and could not convert them. And they could not build any churches inside the walled city. That didn't last, unfortunately. A couple centuries later, there was a rebellion, and the churches were, in fact, turned into mosques. But it shows us that there is variation. It's not a uniform thing wherever, it's not like they go everywhere and then they just do the same thing everywhere. They are pragmatic in that sense. They have to utilize what they have in terms of administering this empire. Usually these kinds of nuances are lost in the public debate, and they should not be lost in the public debate. Now, moving forward, though, starting in the early 16th century, with the conquest of Selim, when he conquers the Memluk lands in Syria and Egypt, several things happen simultaneously. One of them is that the composition of the empire changes, of course. With the conquest of these lands, now you have far more varied populations. The population of Muslims increases, the ratio of Muslims increases as well. So now you have a majority Muslim population. But when we say Muslim, again, there's the problem of what kind of Muslim? There are many different kinds of Muslims in the empire. And that starts to become a problem for the empire, if you're looking at it from the top, by the time of the rise of the Safavids to the east in Persia. That clash, which is an ideological clash, the Shi'i Safavids versus the Sunni Ottomans, focuses the attention of the Ottomans in terms of who they should be acting as, and what they should do with their subjects. In this context, they treat their Muslim subjects pretty badly as well. I mean, Selim is not remembered, for example, by the Alevi population of Turkey today as a great figure, and for good reason. So again, we see the same thread of, the safety of the state, the security of the state being the primary thing, and then everything else follows suit, basically. It's not one uniform ideology of religion and Islamization that governs their thinking. It is more pragmatic than that. In terms of religious differences and strife based on religious differences, you see multiple kinds of religious differences and strife in the Ottoman Empire throughout 600 years or so. And as a Byzantinist, of course, even though I was not studying Byzantine religious history, any Byzantine historian has to have dealt with the various religious conflicts within the Byzantine Empire. And it's not that different in the Ottoman Empire. There are a lot of religion-based issues within the Ottoman Empire, including violent rebellions, including what you might call civil wars to some extent. All these things being put in this sort of quick fashion, given the time constraints that we have, serve to highlight what kinds of problems that we face in both public debate of these subjects and among scholars as well to some extent. I just saw the last one that you see there, this whataboutism thing. Very recently, I'd say maybe a few weeks ago, I was reading something, and this fellow colleague who wrote about Ottoman use of Byzantine buildings essentially said they weren't the only ones to convert monuments for religious purposes. Many churches themselves were built on pagan temples, and so on. And this is basically not even sophisticated, unsophisticated whataboutism. It's not really a scholarly analytical argument. It is being utilized in a scholarly context, published in a scholarly venue, and yet we see a political purpose behind it, don't we? The political purpose behind it is to say, well, the Ottoman conversion of mosques was a perfectly regular practice. I mean, churches into mosques was a perfectly regular practice. And its extension today with Neo-Ottomanism and things like the reconversion of Hagia Sophia and several other churches, for example, in Turkey, is perfectly normal as well. After all religions did this, all empires did this, it's perfectly fine. We see a similar thread in discussions of genocide. When you look at mass violence, one of the common answers along these whataboutism thinking is, well, sure, there was a Greek genocide, an Armenian genocide, not that most people accept it in Turkey, but even if these were genocides, they say, you see it everywhere. The Americans did the same to Native Americans and so on and so forth. So basically, it's a normalization of the process. The reason I'm giving this example is because we as scholars usually think that we are somehow above the public debates. We were not affected by that stuff. We're more sophisticated than that. But we are affected by public debates. We should be part of public debates, and we are not to the extent that we should be. That brings me to the overarching subject here, and that is conquest. I mentioned that already. Now we're coming back to it. I am going to say that, first of all, Islamization as a concept is a subset of conquest, both for the Ottomans and for more modern versions of that idea. Conquest is the more overarching theme. Now, if we compare the Ottoman formulation of conquest, which is a hybrid itself, really, it has elements of Islam in it, it has elements of legitimizing what they do and governing the people that they've conquered. It has elements of continuity in it so that there could be some sort of legitimate presence for century after century for the practices. If you compare that to the Republican ideology that followed in the 20th century, there are significant breaks. Republican ideology, of course, is based on a break with the Ottoman past. The Ottomans were a thing of the past. This is a brand new thing. We have nothing to do with the Ottomans. It's a revolution in everything. Hence, of course, the symbolic things that follow, different script coming in, an alphabet coming in, all kinds of other institutions being created in opposition to what was perceived to be the old, the Ottoman, the unwanted. This new idea of a brand new start, well, there are problems in it if you really start thinking about it. There is plenty of continuity, of course. The founders of the Republic themselves were a continuation of late Ottoman political circles, especially Union of Progress. But also, it gives rise to generation after generation of people in Turkey being educated with a certain concocted fictional history. You can say that this happens in most nation states, part of nation building process and so on, but it's more pronounced in some than others. And the Turkish example is one of the most pronounced, whereby you're taught a history that is essentially telling you that you came from Central Asia at some point. Most of these different narratives talk about 11th century, of course, Manzikert. And then you displaced the local people, and it's as if they never existed after that. They just vanished into thin air. And all these central people who populated this new land, conquered this new land as part of a sort of manifest destiny. And of course, there's this continuity. It has all these different themes in it. 3,000 years of Turkish statehood is mentioned. 16 Turkish states. You can find it in the modern presidential seal of the Turkish Republic. There are 16 stars identifying 16 imaginary states. Some of them don't really exist in history. Others are, strangely associated with modern Turkey. So the result is a lot of people believe this. It's a chimera. That's what I'm talking about. The neo-Ottomanism that we see in the last 2 decades is a strange combination. So if you took this neo-Ottomanism that has elements of Republican ideology in it, it has elements of Islamist ideology in it, and if you had a time machine and you presented this ideology to, I don't know, Süleyman, for example, he would have trouble understanding it. He would have trouble sort of figuring out why these people several hundred years are thinking about this stuff along these lines. But it does involve golden age thinking. It mixes all these things and so on. But the content of the conquest narrative is changing, except conquest itself. Conquest is there. It's central both to the Ottomans, and it's not a single thing within Ottoman Empire. The idea of conquest until the 16th century is one thing. The idea of conquest in the 19th century was something else. And certainly the idea of conquest of these neo-Ottomans now is something else, but it's there. And that leads us to really strange juxtapositions. if you come back to the Hagia Sophia as a symbol of conquest, what you're looking at there, the two pictures that I put side by side, the one on the left with the nude picture is from the 1970s when it was a museum. And in there was this art shoot, photo shoot that involved nudes in the Hagia Sophia. This was seen as something perfectly acceptable at the time because it was, after all, the modern Turkish Republic, secular, this is a museum. These kinds of things are perfectly fine. Of course, at the time, if you proposed something like having, an Orthodox Mass at the Hagia Sophia, this would have been unthinkable. This would have been awful, horrific, that everything would fall apart if something like that was done, but nudes were perfectly okay. To the right, you see the recent conversion ceremony or reconversion ceremony of the Hagia Sophia, where the director of religious affairs sits with his sword, which he doesn't know how to hold, honestly. As a historic fencer, I find it offensive the way that he holds that sword, but anyway. And of course, the symbols of conquest are very prominent in that one. There's the conquest theme is very much there. We're reconquering Hagia Sophia, the good old days are back. That's the message that's being given with that. So it has this one building really in itself deserves volumes of books to be written on it, on how many different meanings are associated with it, how many different agendas are associated with it. There's another one that I didn't include here because of our time constraints, but it shows a very commonly shared social media thread very recently among secular Turks who are sharing a picture of a ballerina in the Hagia Sophia, and they see this, how great it was, how wonderful things were. And then they put it next to a rather corpulent, rather fat individual who went in there after it was converted to a mosque and is sort of reclining in there saying, look, what it was and how awful it is now. Without really processing the fact that during the Republican period, the Hagia Sophia was also, in a sense, abused. It was also a symbol of conquest, only a different kind of conquest. It is not the same conquest, but it is conquest nonetheless. Making it a secular thing, making it a museum does not mean that it is not a symbol of conquest, in other words. Here you see the Hora Church, which is now the Kardia Mosque. And you can see how the mosaics inside were very recently, last year, I believe, covered up with these panels. And it's the same theme with the Hora Mosque, Hora Church as well. But there is this theme here. It's not just conquest, it's also an endless conquest. Because in the modern Turkish imagination, what is distinct from anything that the Ottomans ever thought about Islamization, about conquest, is that they cannot quite become part of the land itself. A vast majority of the Turkish people, having come up with all these different aspects that I just told you, and let's just list them again, they believe they are descendants of people from Central Asia by and large. They believe that they have nothing to do with the other that was vanquished to make space for them. And they are, as a result, unable to process the land and its heritage as their own land and their own heritage. What's Byzantine is the vanquished, the other, and it must be conquered endlessly. So you see this never dying idea of conquest. And when you tell them, well, look, I mean, even if the idea that, most of the people in this country came from Central Asia is true, it's not, but let's say that it is, you've been here for 600 years now, or 1,000 years now, if it's 11th century, depending on where you put the thing. After 1,000 years, why are you still conquering everything? Why are you still so intent on conquering all these objects, all these symbols? And there isn't really an explanation other than the fact that you have not become part of the land itself, because you have been taught that the Byzantines are the other, they are the enemy, that you were created at the expense of the Byzantines. When you tell them that, well, you actually are most likely Byzantines yourselves, just converted over different waves through time, you don't get very good responses. I'll give you a very short anecdote. When I told this to a taxi driver in Ankara, I was left on top of a mountainside. He was so upset that he just threw me out of the taxi. So it is very sort of close to the heart of the public, and this sort of unhealthy formulation about who they are and where they come from bleeds into other things as well. Now, as a counterpart to this, we also see this sort of almost tokenist idea of multiculturalism. whereby the few remaining minorities in the country are seen by mostly, secular Turks as a wonderful sign that this is a wonderful, multicultural country. It's a sign of the past tolerance. Again, we go back to that tolerance narrative. After all, if we wanted to destroy you, you wouldn't be here, they say, with that idea. So it's a wonderful multicultural current day as well. They're very happy about having neighbors who were Greeks and Armenians and Levantines and so on, except of course the reality is not quite that. The reality is that most of these communities are dying or at the edge of disappearing, in the case of Levantines, for example, but probably the last few generations. And scholars themselves absorb this. So you look at very respectable Ottoman scholars, for example, who talk about how awful the current administration and its political Islam is, how this neo-Ottomanism is an awful thing, blah, blah, blah. But their alternative to it is a return, basically, to the Republican version of conquest. Let's make Hagia Sophia a museum again. That's an elegant solution for them. Everything was wonderful during the Republican era. There was no oppression of minorities. Identities were not problematic. The vision of history that the Republic wanted to propose was okay compared to what we have now, is what they're arguing, essentially, in more sophisticated terms. So that brings me to my conclusion, because I don't want to take too much time, of suggestions for us scholars how to engage with this public debate using these issues. First, I want to suggest that we need to keep pointing out and repeatedly pointing out the problems with the common uses of concepts like Islamization, like tolerance, like conquest, the issues with whataboutism, and so on. We do need to avoid jargon. We need to speak in language that everyone can understand. I think a lot of us realize that this is a necessity, that conferences completely closed among scholars are becoming more and more exclusionary, and that's not a good thing for anyone. It's not good for us, it's not good for the public debate, and we are affected by that public debate. And we should engage more with the public, not just in scholarly events. We should make active use of social media, and we can engage with journalists as well. This is something I've done from my own experience. This is something that I'm relating. The recent reconversion of Hagia Sophia, for example, and several other churches opened up an avenue for me to be able to talk about my expertise. And it opened up this sort of wide public debate about the history of these sites, what it is to be, who are the Byzantines, who are the Ottomans, what is conquest, all these things, all these multiple avenues opened up thanks to the public debate about the reconversion of these things. And journalists were open to this. We have avenues like that. And obviously, of course, we have to be prepared for frustration, a lot of frustration when we engage. A lot of misunderstanding, a lot of labels, a lot of intentional targeting, and we have to persevere ultimately. Obviously, I've packed a lot of stuff into this presentation, and each of the items that I'm talking about can be extended for hours, but I want to stop here and leave space for questions or a discussion at the end. Thank
you. Could I be permitted to make a comment?
Please.
Well, I wanted to, first of all, I wanted to commend you on your beautifully ironic treatment of something which is very serious. I mean, it's an important subject. I have two sort of observations. The first is, it made me think of the difference between, for example, Ottoman sort of monuments of conquest in contrast, for example, to the Roman ones. I mean, it's true that, one doesn't really have the equivalent also of, Christian conquest, because in effect, Christianization preceded, it takes place within the empire, but really in Northern Europe, it proceeds through individuals, monks, etc., etc. But in Roman times, of course, what was interesting about the Romans is that they do take over architecture or symbols like columns or whatever and transport them to Rome, and also have these rather grander arches, the Arch of Hadrian, of Trajan, and so on and so forth. That doesn't seem to exist very much in Ottoman sort of architecture. In other words, that type of symbolism of having captured. And partly, I suppose, it's because the idea is, as you pointed out, is primarily capturing land. And the people are in a way like chattels or tied to the land. But the consequence of all this idea, which I thought was really interesting, this idea of perpetual conquest, in a way, in the contemporary world, or relatively recently, it seems to be turned inwards, because then you have the enemy within. And in a way, the system needs to generate always enemies within, and challenges to overcome them. That's just an observation that came to my mind. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you very much. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Absolutely, I agree. And in fact, it's ironic because today Istanbul, for example, is called by the periphery, which is the rest of Turkey, as Byzantium. You know, it's a pejorative term. The Byzantines are in Istanbul. You know, they are the ones who are always scheming for things and so on. And it has multiple pejorative meanings. But also about the architecture thing you're talking about, yes, they do not use that many materials from the past. So, for example, unlike Romans or Byzantines who brought stuff from Egypt, from Carthage, and so on and so forth, they don't do that as much. But if you look at the monumental architecture, especially mosque architecture, imperial mosque architecture, it really is a continuation of and a sort of rivalry with the Hagia Sophia. It is so impressive, so sort of impressed on their minds that this is the dominant civilization that they're taking over and continuing, that when you look at the Süleymaniye Mosque, for example, in any other mosque, that you see the same dome structures and so on, with some innovations, of course, but the influence is clear as well.
Yes, I mean, there's a type of mimetic, sort of competition. I mean, to my mind, there's a sort of, the mirror image of Hagia Sophia is the Alhambra in Granada, because one of them is turned into a church, and the other is turned into a mosque. And when apparently Philip, or Charles, I think it was his father, saw what they had done, he said, "You have ruined the jewel." In other words, he appreciated it as it was, as a mosque, and he thought it was disastrous to turn it into a church. Just an observation.
Excuse me for a moment.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we need to have the talk of Professor Kaya, who is, I think, waiting to present his ideas. So I'd like to thank Professor Corlu again very much, and we'll now pass on to the talk of Professor Kaya. We'll be speaking about the hidden family stories, Islamization in exchange period. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Firstly, thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the committee. I hope everything is fine there. Today, I would like to talk about untold and hidden family stories and Islamization process in the exchange period. As you know, our conference name is Islamization during the period of Ottoman Empire, but my work is not in the directly Ottoman Empire period. It's the really end of the Ottoman period. Also, I can say that the first step of the Turkish Republic. To be understandable, I want to start with my family story shortly. My great-grandfather's name was Isaac, and he was born in a Greek Aydoğdu village near to Samsunta and Amasya. In the exchange period, his family exiled this part of Turkey, his mother, his younger brother, and sister. However, his father died before the exchange. He starts to work as a servant in the Muslim family. One day, gendarmeries came and forced the family to leave my grandfather there alone. He was just 12 years old. He stayed and assimilated in time. They made him Muslim. He died as Muslim, and his grave in Muslim cemetery now in Izmir. It was not his choice. He was separated from his family. He was alone and angry to his fate until to die. In the 1960s, his younger brother, Yannis, came and found my great-grandfather. Neighbors learned that my great-grandfather originally Greek, and they complained to gendarmeries. My grandfather couldn't survive anymore there and migrate to Izmir. Of course, social pressure continued. Entire life of my great-grandfather, he did not say even one word about his past. Just one sentence: I'm from Pontus, Amasya. He prohibited in the family about asking any question about his past, his parents, his village, his Islamization process. Nobody talked about it in the family. When I learned hidden family story, our Pontus origin, our Greek origin, I was just 10 years old. When I was in high school, I interested in history, and in the university, I started to work on ethnic minorities in Turkey and their rights. After many years, with the help of luck, I found our relatives in Greece in 2013. I started to talk about my sad story, hidden story, and assimilation process of my grandfather in the conferences. I took many calls around Turkey from different cities. I took many messages, supportive messages. People started to share their family stories with me. Of course, on the other hand, I took many threatening messages too. I decided to write my master thesis about it, and I started to collect other stories and made an interview with them. I used oral history as a method in the ethnographical research. My work published in Turkish first, then published in Greek. And I still continue getting supportive messages from Turkey and Greece too. Now I'm writing my PhD thesis about relation between memory and identity in the Islamized Greeks in Turkey and possibility of personal ethnic revival. And in the first time in Turkish national history, somebody is working about this topic. As you know, the population exchange between Turkey and Greece in 1923 and 24 was grounded on the idea of exchanging people based on their religion. However, there were some people like my grandfather who were not involved in the exchange for different reasons, even if they were subjected to. These people mainly consisted of women and children, avoided the exchange through marriage and adoption, or they were taken as servants or kidnapped and became separated from their families. Those who escaped the exchange converted to dominant religion, Islam, and pretended to be a part of the majority so that they can be accepted in the society. And they concealed their real stories, of course. My works focus on these people, their untold stories, and aims to understand why they have been unable to tell these stories, their experiences of forced acculturation and assimilation, their new identities, practice of forgetting and remembering. Also, I am trying to clarify the law of remembering. The conversion stories remained untold for years because of social pressure first and daily hostile policies to Greece and Greeks from Turkey. There was a propaganda named Speak Turkish. There was a capital tax law in 1942. There was a pogrom against non-Muslims in 7 September 1955, Septembriana we call. Greeks from Istanbul forced to migrate in 1964. Cyprus operations were in 1970s. These kind of hostile policies against non-Muslim of Anatolians continues. If you were Islamized Greek, could you expose yourself in that period? It looks impossible. However, today, especially young generations, grandchilds of Islamized Greeks are talking because they don't want to hide their origin anymore. In the last few years in Turkey, you can see there are many works on Kurdish and Armenian collective memories, especially about the Kurdish exile in 1990s and Armenian exile in 1915. The point is, the truth always comes out. And my work says, Greeks are still here, although they are Islamized. Thank you for listening.
Now, Professor Michailidis. Professor Michailidis.
I'd like to invite Professor Michailidis, who will be speaking now about conversion to Islam, memory and music in Trebizond.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nikos Michailidis. I'm an anthropologist, and I'm going to present a paper about conversion of Greek communities in the Black Sea region in Pontus, conversion to Islam, and about the consequences of this conversion. Unfortunately, due to an unexpected scheduling conflict, I had to record my presentation and submit it to the committee. The northeastern coastal region of Asia Minor was the center of a state that was known as the Empire of Trebizond that lasted from 1204 up to 1461 AD. This was the last part of Byzantium to remain outside the influence and control of the rising Turco-Islamic states of the Anatolian interior. It surrendered to the Sultan Mehmed II in 1461. Nevertheless, the Byzantine inhabitants of the Empire of Trebizond, though incorporated into the Ottoman administrative structures, remained relatively unaffected by Ottoman rule for more than a century after the Ottoman conquest of the city. During the second century of Ottoman rule, because of both conversion and immigration, the balance between Islam and Christianity started to shift in favor of the former. However, substantial numbers of these new convert Muslims, many of them descendants of older Byzantine people, continue to speak mother tongues different than Turkish. Muslims started becoming the majority in this region in the 16th century, almost 400 years after the rest of Anatolia. Even then, the inhabitants of this region of Pontus, Black Sea, spoke a variety of languages, including Pontic Greek, Laz, Hemsin Armenian, Georgian, and of course Turkish. In the period after the Ottoman conquest, the Ottoman tax registers of year 1554 revealed that the population of the city of Trebizond was still largely Christian, while almost 30 years later, in 1583, it was more than 50% Muslim and yet remained about 70% Greek-speaking. A segment of the Christians of Trebizond were first Islamized, converted to Islam, and then gradually Turkified linguistically. The ethnically Turkish input was relatively small in the region, and the factor most responsible for the growth of the city's Muslim community was Christian conversion. This was not a sudden process that occurred in the wake of the city's conquest in 1461, but took place gradually over the next 125 years. As a result of this lengthy process of conversion to Islam, Trebizond became a city with a Muslim majority, but retained much of its pre-conquest, pre-Islamic character. Thus, the Turkification of the city was still in its very early stages at the end of the 16th century. It is important to note that in places where Islamization took place, but the Greek language continued to be spoken among the converts, old toponyms remained in use. Thus, the name of the city, Trebizond, which was given by its ancient Greek founders, the Greek original was Trapezus or Trapezunda, remained the same for centuries and remains today the same in its Turkic form. In Turkish, it is called Trabzon. In some villages of this region, in Trabzon, sermons were delivered in Turkish, but also commonly in Pontic Greek, with Quranic citations in Arabic in both cases. Quranic texts as well were discussed in Turkish, but also commonly in Pontic Greek. The Muslim descendants of the Pontic Greek-speaking Christians appear to have made an important contribution to the tradition of religious study in the villages of this district. The Trebizond yearbook for 1888 states that lessons in the religious academies of a particular region, the region of Of, were sometimes given in Pontic Greek, even though most of the population in the district was also Turkish-speaking. Up to the 1960s, much of the population in the district still spoke Pontic Greek in their families and villages. The extent to which conversions were real or just superficial is not totally clear. The fact that various communities of converts to Islam decided to declare in the 19th century that they were actually Christians, Orthodox Christians, who were pretending to have converted to Islam in order to survive, tells us that for some of these communities, passing as Muslim was just a means of survival. For others, it might well have been a sincere commitment to their new religion. We should also keep in mind, as historian Maria Todorova argued, that the Ottoman Empire, and I'm quoting from her, the Ottoman Empire was first and foremost an Islamic state with a strict religious hierarchy, where the non-Muslims occupied without any doubt the back seats. The strict division on religious lines prevented integration of the population except in cases of conversion. End of quote. This structural inequality certainly contributed significantly to the gradual rise in the numbers of the believers, the adherents of Islam. Conversion, from the perspective of many Orthodox Christian Greeks of the region at that time, meant that the convert was aligning with the Ottoman ruler. Conversion was later described by the use of the derogatory word Türkyilmaz. He became a Turk. Nevertheless, the crossing of this crucial religious borderline by an individual did not automatically mean that he would suddenly abandon all his previous habits, ideas, social connections, and way of life. Oral testimonies from the Pontic Greek refugees of 1923 in Greece, as well as memoirs written by educated members of the community, attest to the fact that various degrees of ties and collaboration and interaction between new converts to Islam and their Christian relatives were maintained in various places in Eastern Pontus. This religious ambivalence caused significant problems. Religious, social, and cultural ambivalence caused significant problems, not only for the government and the state, the Ottoman state, but also at the local level in the city of Trebizond. We have recorded cases where the burial of a deceased person who is officially registered as a Muslim became a matter of dispute between local Christians and Muslims. Faik Hursit Gyunday, a Turkish bureaucrat who served in the district of Of in Trebizond at the beginning of the 20th century, published his memoirs in 1960. In his memoirs, in his book, he argues that immediately after the announcement of the restoration of the constitutional monarchy in 1908, Muslims in the Trebizond districts of Matsuka, Tonya, Yomra, and Sarli, some cities and towns in this area, started declaring that they would convert to Christianity. They would convert back to Christianity. Various incidents occurred because of this declaration. For example, when a person died, the Orthodox Greeks would claim that the deceased was a Christian, and the Muslims would claim that he was a Muslim. Then they would both claim the right to bury him. After government officials carried out an investigation in each case, the right to bury the deceased would sometimes be given to the Christians and sometimes to the Muslims. And in some instances, when the dispute could not reach a resolution, the deceased would get buried by the government. Gyunday describes the following interesting incidents. These people, he says, were registered in the official documents with Muslim names, and their fathers' names appeared as Muslim too. Despite this, they claimed that they were Orthodox Christians, that they had Greek names like Yanni and Nico, and that to survive, they had to live as crypto-Christians. They also pointed out that they were the Muslims of Osman Pasha, and until the constitutional period, even though they were Orthodox Christians, they would publicly appear as Muslims. They said that they had to maintain their Christian faith secretly. Osman Pasha, the governor of Trebizond in 1844, had forced the Orthodox Christians of these districts to convert to Islam. With the declaration of the constitution and the incidents of apostasy from Islam, the truth was revealed. It was also found that in the same region, and especially in the places where apostasy incidents occurred, there were no mosques, religious schools, or preachers. The crypto-Christian experience was very similar in different parts of the Ottoman Empire. They had double names, Christian and Muslim. They were baptized and kept the fasts, while some of them would undergo circumcision or hold Christian and Muslim wedding ceremonies. Moreover, their daughters did not marry out, and Muslim brides brought in were secretly baptized. They prayed at the mosque, especially during the month of Ramadan. Sometimes they were buried in a Muslim cemetery, but with a simultaneous Christian service. Various cases of apostasy from Islam during the late 19th century are recorded in Greek and Ottoman archives, referring to the Greek-speaking communities of various districts of Trebizond. It is interesting to note that in some cases, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Ottoman officials would issue decisions ordering local authorities in Trebizond to force populations that showed tendencies of apostasy to send their children to school and give them Muslim names, and to send reliable Muslim preachers to their villages to strengthen their Islamic faith. Now, let me say a few things about how this conversion to Islam of the Greek population influenced their musical listening habits and their musical culture. The conversion of segments of the Orthodox Greek population to Sunni Islam in Trebizond impacted, as it was expected, their musical habits. Music listening in the context of the new religion became an ambivalent sign of cultural alterity, of difference, and a source of suspicion and criticism from mainstream religious networks in modern Turkey. The impact of religious conversion on musical practices can be traced back to the 19th century through a very important, very valuable source that I was able to locate during my research, a text that was written by Ioannis Parcharidis in the late 19th century, but it was published in 1928, 18 years after Parcharidis' death. His article was published in the Greek journal Lauritzen, and in that text, Parcharidis described the musical life of the Muslim Pontic Greek speakers of one particular region of Trebizond as he experienced it firsthand during his long professional activity in the district as a school teacher. Parcharidis described the people of Of in Trebizond as bilingual Greeks who converted to Islam, adding that as a result their language contains many ancient Greek and Turkish words, and that it is difficult for the inhabitants of Trebizond, of the city, to understand the Greek dialect of the people of Of and vice versa. During his stay with the Muslim Greek speakers of this region, Parcharidis observed that they rarely sang songs that had been created in the past and never memorized songs. Rather, they constantly created new lyrics while they were singing, according to Parcharidis' observations. Parcharidis, having done extensive research in the nearby Christian villages in the broader region of Trebizond, found that in these Christian villages there were various songs that were memorized and sung. These songs were related to historical events, usually of some kind of patriotic character. Nevertheless, he was unable to find such heroic historical songs among the Muslim Pontic Greek speakers. The explanation he provided is that this happened because these Greeks had converted to Islam, and since those songs referred to things Christian, the rise of Islamic religiosity gradually pushed them to the margins until they completely disappeared from the memory of the people. Parcharidis also argued that a similar process of forgetting was underway in the field of language too, where Pontic Greek, identified by local Islamic preachers with Christianity, was gradually being replaced by Turkish, which was identified with Islam. He was also unable to find among the Muslim Pontic Greek speakers stories told by all other Greeks of Trebizond. The converted Greeks, as he characterized them, narrated tales taken from the Islamic tradition, such as those of the famous Nasreddin Hoxha. Parcharidis also attributed the vanishing of memorized songs to the abandonment of the local dance culture that was put under the strict surveillance and prohibition of the new religion. It was locally unacceptable for a pious Muslim to dance and thus use his or her body in excessive ways that might arouse sexual desire. From what he observed during his various trips to different parts of Trebizond in the late 19th century, it was mainly the Christians who danced and rarely the Muslims, he says, and when the latter did so, they danced to the accompaniment of a drum and of the kaval, a local flute, whose soft sound did not allow for much singing. Christians, meanwhile, danced to the Pontic lyra, whose sound was very, very strong. Parcharidis concluded that the Pontic lyra had almost disappeared from the musical culture of the Muslims of Off. Finally, he attributed the vanishing of memorized songs in this community to the prohibition of alcohol consumption. Alcohol raises the spirits and creates an appropriate mood for singing and dancing among the Christians. But for the Muslims, it is strictly prohibited, as Parcharidis writes in his memoirs. The constant remembrance and reproduction of older songs needed a constant repetition in social gatherings where alcohol was usually consumed. Thus, the prohibition of its consumption must have certainly played a significant role in the shaping of the new ways music was made and listened to in social gatherings in these communities. Parcharidis lived with these convert communities in a very turbulent period, the end of the 19th century, when the Ottoman state had lost territories and was in constant competition and even conflict with its big competitor in the region, Russia. The incidence of apostasy from Islam also added to the already tense conditions and the insecurity of the elites. Islamic preachers in such a context must have been instrumental in the struggle of the administration to maintain people's Islamic faith and political loyalty, two things that were closely interrelated. The retreat of the local dance culture in Off, a region, a small town in Trebizond, and the omission of the Pontic lyra from the community's musical repertoire, the prohibition of alcohol consumption, the absence of memorized songs and of songs about historical events, the existence of stories from the Islamic tradition in their oral tradition, should all be interpreted as the outcome of conversion and, more importantly, of the activities of the local preachers to transform the converts, these new converts, into good Muslims. This conversion triggered a process of long cultural transition, which was incomplete in the sense that it did not manage to incorporate and change completely all aspects of life. The outcome of this was a local cultural complexity that combined Christian and Islamic elements in new forms. A new type of Muslim rose in Trebizond among these communities, one that sometimes deviated from the monolithic, centrally designed notions of Islamic piety and personhood. And I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much for listening.
I would like to thank very much Professor Kyrou for this very interesting presentation. And I think we have, given the time, we have just about room for one or two questions. So if there's anything from the audience or from those listening online, just ask the question.
May I make a couple of points?
Yes, go ahead.
So, as I was listening to the presentations of my colleagues, two things came to my mind. One of them is how, well, first of all, the ironic thing, of course, is that some of the most extreme manifestations of Turkish nationalism today come from the Black Sea region, and in particular from Trabzon. That's something that to keep in mind and perhaps think about a little bit. But the other thing is, one of the things that I see very commonly in engaging the modern day public as far as identity, origins, and these ideas, is that two things are happening. One, with the popularization and more accessible nature of DNA tests in our time, more people in Turkey, for example, are doing this stuff. And what they find out and how they process the results of those DNA tests is worthy of a study in its own right. It's very interesting. Some of them are suddenly realizing, hey, you know, we don't have that Central Asian stuff as much as we thought we did. So they are looking into their origins more seriously. Others are not. And in part, this is in part because these DNA testing companies are, perhaps to make it more accessible, perhaps to make more money, they're trying to do some shortcuts to the customers. And this is true in all kinds of places where they make sort of very easy connections between what is in fact scientifically rather ambiguous. And they make it sound like very clear. They're saying, aha, your family was specifically from this area and from this group and so on and so forth. And the public that sort of tries to engage with this, when you're a historian who says that the number of Turkic people who came into Anatolia was very small, they immediately go to this DNA stuff and start to discuss things based on that. And we have to just sort of try to tell them that no, long before this DNA stuff, genetic testing and so on became popular, historians were able to gauge these numbers to begin with. We have the means to do that. We know, for example, more or less the population of Anatolia or Asia Minor in the 11th century, the Byzantine population there. We know more or less the structure of that population, the Armenians and a whole bunch of different people. We know the kinds of population that nomadic cultures can sustain. So more or less, we already knew that maybe 100,000 or more people came into Anatolia in the 11th century, and they were less than 10%, maybe even 5% of the existing population there. Now, I'm not suggesting that identity has to be connected to some kind of idea of race or anything like that, but this is how the public, processes it. And this is how they connect things, unfortunately, in their minds. So when you talk about the DNA stuff that's going on now, the two kinds of revelation, one, oh, wow, we're not Central Asian, and two, oh, yeah, we are Central Asian. They coexist. And as historians, when we engage them, we have to be very careful in order to tell them that this is not some ultimate thing, that identity is not just that. And also, we have historically traceable lineages of identity coming through. It is not an extreme statement to say that most of the people in Turkey today are descendants of people who were there in Byzantine times. It is also not strange or wrong to say that lots of population movements have happened since then. So there are all kinds of pitfalls in the sort of modern era. It's a Pandora's box that has been opened. And as historians, we have to engage with the genetic research material as well to make it more understandable and more accessible to the public. Otherwise, if left to their own devices, it's not going to be straightforward. Thank you.
Very much for these insightful points. Unfortunately, I think the other speakers are not present to be able to answer, so we'll just have to accept these as an excellent summary of the points which have been addressed in this session. So I think that's, and given the time, I think we're ready to for the next step, which is probably dinner for most of us.
Yes.
So, exactly. And then resting probably is an option too. So I'd like to thank you very much for your attention and for staying here till this session and following carefully all the proceedings.
Thank you very much.
Very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.